Have you ever heard of a city that pops up basically overnight? Like a city bigger than New York, packed with millions of people. Not for a concert or a game, but for a ritual bath.
It's really something else.
It's the Kumbh Mela, the world's largest human gathering.
Yeah.
A spectacle that seems like it's been happening forever. A timeless tradition, but
But you know what's really fascinating?
what?
The Kumbh Mela, in its current form, is actually a pretty recent thing.
Really?
Yeah, it's like a tapestry woven from threads of much older traditions.
Okay, so today we're going on a deep dive into the Kumbh Mela, specifically its historical roots. We're talking ancient beginnings, separating myth from reality,
Mhm.
and tracing its evolution from what? Simple river dips to this mega event.
Yeah, exactly. And the journey starts long before the Kumbh Mela as we know it. The idea of ritual bathing in sacred rivers for purification that's deeply rooted in Hinduism. We're talking Vedic times going way back.
Huh. So the idea of a purifying dip isn't new. But how do we get from that to the massive organized Kumbh Mela? I mean, everyone's heard that story about gods and demons fighting over a pot of nectar, right? Drops spilling at these specific locations, creating the Kumbh Mela cities.
Ah, yes, the Samudra Manthan myth. It's a classic. But here's where things get really interesting. This specific Kumbh Mela origin story, the nectar spilling and all that, it's actually a later addition to the original myth. It's not in the early texts.
So it's like someone sprinkled a little Kumbh Mela magic onto an existing story.
Yeah.
But then where do we find the first real hints of something resembling the Kumbh Mela in the history, I mean?
Prayag or Prayagraj, as we know it today, seems to be at the heart of it. Even before the term Kumbh Mela appeared, Prayag was a bustling pilgrimage site.
Uh-huh.
You have texts like the Rig Veda, one of the oldest Hindu scriptures mentioning Prayag. The Mahabharata, too, talks about ritual bathing there for atonement.
Makes sense, right? Confluence of three sacred rivers, the Ganges, the Yamuna, and the mythical Saraswati. Talk about a spiritual trifecta. It must have been a major pilgrimage site even back then.
Absolutely. And there are these fascinating texts called the Prayag Mahatmya, basically ancient guidebooks for pilgrims. They detail the bustling scene at Prayag with pilgrims, priests, and the energy of a major gathering.
Wait, so these guidebooks, did they mention the Kumbh Mela? Like, were they telling pilgrims, hey, come for the Kumbh Mela every 12 years?
That's the intriguing part. They don't.
Yeah.
They're full of details about Prayag's significance, the geography, the rituals, but no mention of a 12-year cycle or the name Kumbh Mela. It's like a piece of the puzzle is missing.
Okay, now that's what I call a good historical mystery. And we even have accounts from outside India, right? Like that Chinese Buddhist traveler.
Yes. Xuanzang in the 7th century, he was a keen observer, and he describes Prayag as a significant pilgrimage site, hundreds of temples, a major bathing ritual. Now, there's some debate. Was it a 5-year event or 12? Was it purely Hindu, or did Buddhism have a role? But it clearly shows Prayag's importance as a spiritual center, even centuries before the Kumbh Mela as we know it.
So if it wasn't always called the Kumbh Mela, what was it? Just a bunch of smaller, random bathing festivals. How do we get from those to this mega event?
There's a strong connection to the Magha Mela. So this was a well-established bathing festival tied to the month of Magha, held at many sacred river sites, including the ones where we now celebrate the Kumbh Mela.
So it's like the Magha Mela was the prototype, and the Kumbh Mela evolved from that. I'm starting to see how these ancient traditions laid the groundwork. But what about the name Kumbh Mela? When does that actually appear?
That's where we see the shift from Magha Mela to Kumbh Mela. And it gets even more interesting when we bring in the Mughals and later the British. So you know how we were talking about those Prayag Mahatmya texts, those ancient guidebooks for pilgrims?
Yeah.
They don't actually mention the 12-year cycle or use the name Kumbh Mela at all.
Right. It's like this big mystery. How did the name Kumbh Mela even come about? It seems so central to the event now, but...
It's a really fascinating blend of religious tradition and, socio-political forces.
Okay.
And it all starts to come together during the Mughal era.
Yeah.
The term Kumbh Mela starts appearing in texts from that time. But there's a catch. It's only used for Haridwar.
Wait, so not even Prayag? I thought that was supposed to be like the prime location where the nectar spilled and all that.
Right, that's what makes it so interesting. It seems Haridwar was actually the original Kumbh Mela, and it was tied to the astrological sign of Aquarius, which is Kumbha in Sanskrit. We see this in texts like the Kulasa-ut-Tawarik from the late 17th century. They specifically mention a 12-year cycle at Haridwar, but for Prayag, they only talk about an annual bathing festival.
So how does Prayag, the place we now associate so strongly with the Kumbh Mela,
Yeah.
get in on the action? Was it just like, hey, that name's catchy, we want it too?
Well, it seems the Prayagwal Brahmins, the priests responsible for the rituals at Prague, saw how popular the Kumbh Mela label was becoming, and they decided to adopt it for their own annual Maga Mela, essentially rebranding it in the mid-19th century.
Wow, so right in the middle of British rule, a spiritual rebranding campaign. And what about the other Kumbh Mela locations? Nashik and Ujjain, do they always have that name too?
They also had ancient bathing festivals, but again, no Kumbh Mela label in the early texts. Nashik had the Sinkhas Mela tied to the astrological sign of Leo. It's likely that they, seeing the success of the Kumbh Mela branding at Prayag and Haridwar, decided to adopt the name too.
Okay, so we've got this evolution of the name, a blending of tradition, and let's be honest, a bit of marketing savvy. But we can't talk about the Kumbh Mela without talking about the British Rite. They had a huge impact on India, so I'm guessing they had a hand in shaping the Mela as well.
Absolutely. The East India Company, as you know, was all about control. They saw the Kumbh Melas with their massive crowds and potential for chaos as a challenge, but also an opportunity.
So were they interested in the spiritual aspect at all, or was it all about like taxes and revenue? Taxing pilgrims seems like it would be pretty unpopular.
Well, it definitely caused resistance, but beyond the financial aspect, the British saw the need to manage these events for safety and logistics. Imagine millions of people with limited infrastructure, and then you add in the warrior monks.
Wait, warrior monks. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me everything.
We're talking about the Akara's organized groups, who were, let's just say, not your typical peaceful meditators. They were a major force at the Kumbh Melas and still are today, although their role has changed significantly.
So they were already part of the scene even before the British. What exactly did they do?
Before the British got involved, the Akaras were basically in charge. They managed logistics, resolved disputes, kept some semblance of order. Think of them as a combination of religious leaders, event organizers, and security forces all rolled into one.
Warrior monks running the show. That's quite a mental image. I'm guessing it wasn't always peaceful, though, right?
You're right to guess that. These Akaras were fiercely competitive, especially when it came to ritual primacy. Who gets to bathe first? Who has the most prominent position in the procession? These things were a big deal.
It's amazing how something as seemingly spiritual as a ritual bath can get wrapped up in ego and power struggles.
And those struggles sometimes turn violent. We have historical records of some pretty intense clashes between different Akaras, even resulting in deaths. For example, in 1760 at the Haridwar Kumbh Mela, a fight broke out between two groups and hundreds of people died.
Wow, so it wasn't all peaceful chanting and ritual dips. So when the British show up, they see this potential for chaos and decide they need to step in.
Exactly. The company, seeing this volatile mix of warrior monks, massive crowds, and lucrative trade opportunities, decided they needed to impose some order. They started regulating the Kumbh Mela, laying out camping areas, assigning bathing orders for the Akaras, basically trying to impose some British structure on this very Indian event.
So from unruly monks to British bureaucracy, I can't imagine the Akaras were too thrilled about this. Did they just accept the British taking control?
There was definitely resistance. But the British were persistent, and their efforts to formalize the Kumbh Mela really laid the groundwork for how these events are managed even today. After India's independence, this role passed from the British to the state governments, who continued to play a key role in organizing and managing the massive logistics.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient bathing rituals to the emergence of the Kumbh Mela name to the British stepping in and imposing their own systems. What does this all mean for the Kumbh Mela as we know it today? How did it become this cultural phenomenon that draws millions of people?
That's where we see the Kumbh Mela evolving beyond a purely religious event. It becomes a stage for all sorts of social, political, and cultural interactions.
So it's not just about the ritual bath anymore. What else is happening at the Kumbh Mela?
Think about it. You have millions of people from all walks of life converging in one place. It's an incredible opportunity for trade and commerce.
Right, a captive audience of millions. What kind of things were being sold back then?
Pretty much everything you can imagine. Historical accounts from the 19th century mention merchants coming from all over India and even beyond, selling food, textiles, spices, religious artifacts, you name it. It was like a massive open-air market.
So it was a blend of spirituality and commerce, not unlike many ancient pilgrimages. But you said it goes beyond just buying and selling, right? What other roles did the Kumbh Mela take on?
For the Akaras, the Kumbh Mela was also a prime recruiting ground. They'd attract new followers, initiate them into their order, bolster their ranks. It was a chance to connect with like-minded individuals, share ideas, and join a larger spiritual community.
It's fascinating how religion and recruitment were intertwined in this way, but I wonder, was it always a peaceful process?
Well, as we've seen, the Akaras were known for their competitiveness, so I imagine things could get heated sometimes.
And then you add in the British influence trying to impose order on this already complex system.
It's a recipe for both conflict and innovation.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. It sounds like the Kumbh Mela wasn't just a religious event. It was a microcosm of India itself with all its complexities and contradictions. I'm ready for the next layer of this deep dive. So we've got this uh, melting pot of spirituality, commerce, even a bit of political intrigue brewing at the Kumbh Mela. It's not just about that ritual dip anymore, but how did it evolve from that to like the cultural phenomenon we see today?
What's really interesting is how the Kumbh Mela went beyond just religion and actually became a catalyst for all sorts of social and political movements, especially during India's struggle for independence.
You're saying the Kumbh Mela played a part in India's fight for freedom. I never would have guessed that.
Think about it. The Kumbh Mela was this huge gathering of people from all corners of India.
Right.
It gave nationalist leaders a way to connect with the masses, spread their message, rally support. It was like a pre-digital age social network, fostering a sense of shared identity and purpose.
It's amazing how this ancient tradition became a part of such a pivotal moment in India's history. It wasn't just about religious beliefs, it was about national identity.
Exactly. And that ability to connect and share ideas continues today, although in different ways. The Kumbh Mela still attracts all sorts of people, not just for religious reasons. Politicians use it as a platform, activists promote their causes, and various cultural and social groups see it as a chance for exchange and dialogue.
So it's this really dynamic event, a reflection of India itself. But I have to ask, with India modernizing so rapidly, how will the Kumbh Mela adapt? Can something so ancient survive in our fast-paced, technology-driven world?
That's a good question, isn't it? Will it keep its spiritual core while embracing technology and changing social norms?
I mean, they've already got AI-powered surveillance systems and apps to help pilgrims navigate the site. It's kind of mind-blowing to think about how something so old can embrace all these new things.
Yeah, it speaks to the enduring power of tradition, I think, and that human need to connect with something bigger than ourselves. The Kumbh Mela, with all its complexity and grandeur, is proof of that.
So for all of you listening, next time you hear about the Kumbh Mela, remember it's not just a news story. It's a look into a tradition that's centuries old, a tradition that reflects the very heart of India. It's a reminder that even in our world, some things never change, that yearning for connection, meaning, and something more.
That's something worth thinking about.
Definitely. And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the Kumbh Mela.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep diving deep.